What's up, you guys? Doing another Tomes of Terror. Today we're doing kind of like, I guess this is sort of like a classic. It came out in 1983, you know, a horror classic, gothic classic, especially British gothic. If you're a fan of British horror and gothic fiction in general, you may have already read this, but I had actually not. I'll get into that in a moment. But this is The Woman in Black by Susan Hill. This is an interesting one. I picked this in particular just because, one, it gets recommended all the time, you know, by people that are like, oh, the scariest ghost stories or whatever. And I really like classic ghost stories. I really like gothic fiction. I really like British ghost stories in particular. And I had seen both film adaptations of this book. So I was really kind of interested to, you know, read the source material and see how much it differed. Now, because of that, I am going to discuss the movies a little bit, just in the sense of like how they were different from the book. So this actually may have some spoilers, but I will like warn you before I spoil anything, like before I talk about like the differences in the ends of the book and the movies and stuff. I actually had a recommendation from one of our listeners that I should probably, you know, just kind of talk about the book, review the book, and then after a certain point, like warn everybody and say, hey, there's going to be spoilers after this point if you want to read the book, because it is kind of like, it does kind of hamstring you a little bit when you can't really talk about like major plot points in the book, you know, maybe if you want like a deeper discussion of it. So I think I might start doing that from here on out. I wanted to do it with this book in particular just because I feel like this book may be somewhat more familiar than some of the other ones I did, not only because it's older, but also because it's been adapted so many times. And I think most people, particularly, you know, in the UK, are probably fairly familiar with the story, even if they've never read it. So I don't think it'll hurt anything too badly if I spoil some stuff. But like I said, I will warn you ahead of time before I do that. So that said, let's talk a little bit about the story. Now, as I said, most people are probably familiar with it, but in case you are not, this is basically set in, I guess it's sometime in the late 19th century, early 20th century. I want to say around that time, or around the turn of the century. Maybe a little later, not really sure. There is a young solicitor at a firm, and his name is Arthur Kipps. I believe he says he's 26 years old. And he has, you know, an upcoming marriage. He's engaged to his girlfriend, Stella, and he's very excited about that. And he's kind of a junior partner in a law firm run by Mr. Bentley. So he's kind of looking for an assignment that's kind of gonna, you know, show Mr. Bentley that he has what it takes to be partner, like at least get a raise or something like that, so he can get married and, you know, they can have like a decent life together. So the first big assignment that he is given, he gets sent to settle the affairs of this woman, Mrs. Drablow. Now, she was a widow, and she has just died in this rather remote town because Arthur Kipps, you know, he lives and works in London. So it's kind of this remote, like, market town called Crwthyn Gifford, which I don't know. I don't think that's a real town, but correct me if I'm wrong. I've never heard of it before. It sounds Welsh. But so basically, Mrs. Drablow, who was kind of very reclusive, she was the client of the of this law firm where Arthur Kipps works. And she has passed away. So Arthur basically has to go to the town where she lived and go to her house and go through all of her papers. And if he finds anything of significance, he has to send them back to, you know, he basically, like I said, just has to settle her affairs because that's kind of what the solicitor does. So he kind of looks forward to this. He's like, oh, it's like a big assignment. He doesn't think it's going to take very long. You know, it's like, oh, a few days in the country. It'll be nice to get out of, you know, all the smog and all the noise and stuff like that in London. So he says goodbye to his fiancée, Stella, and gets on the train and heads off to this tiny little town. Now, while he's on the train, he meets this guy named Samuel Daly, who seems to know something about the town, but is sort of cagey about it. And that's kind of another thing that happens a lot in this book, is that even when he gets to the town, the people in the town aren't necessarily hostile. And as a matter of fact, like the couple that owns like the inn where he stays at first are actually very friendly and very welcoming. But when he asks people like about Mrs. Drablow, like, oh, I heard she was kind of reclusive and all this other kind of stuff, people kind of clam up a little bit. Like they don't really want to talk about it. So it's not so much hostility as everyone's just kind of like, and this, like, they don't want to talk about it. So he figures something weird's going on, but he's very young. He's very ambitious. This is his first big job. He doesn't want to mess it up. And he basically just thinks, oh, it's a bunch of small town silliness. It's like, this won't take long. It'll be fine, He just is going on with it, and he doesn't really think anything of it. So it ends up that he gets taken out. Well, first thing first, he has to go to Mrs. Drablow's funeral, which not a lot of people show up at. And a little bit of a weird thing happens there where he sees across the cemetery this woman who's wearing like a black dress, like mourning clothes. But like I said, it's not too weird because it's a funeral, sure. But also she's kind of like weird looking. Like she looks like she has some kind of like wasting disease. Like she's very pale and she looks very skeletal. He doesn't think of it as a ghost necessarily, but he just thinks, oh, it's just this mourner. And it's like she kind of stayed well back from everybody. And he also he sees her in the church as well. And then he sees her out at the cemetery, but she always kind of like when he goes to look for her afterward to find out who she is, and maybe she's a relative or something, he can't figure out where she went. So he ends up asking this other solicitor that lives in the town, Mr. Jerome. He's like, so what was the deal with that woman with the black clothes on that I saw in the church and at the funeral and stuff? And he's just like, I have no idea what you're talking about. But honestly, obviously he does know what he's talking about because he's like shitting his pants pretty much. So he's like, that's odd. So he thinks it's weird, but again, he doesn't really think anything of it. So then he ends up having to go out to Mrs. Drablow's house, which is now empty. Now, many of the people in town, and he meets up with Samuel Daly again, who it turns out was kind of like a wealthy merchant. He's like a landowner and stuff, and he lives around there, and they kind of become friends a little bit. Most people are saying, no one's ever going to buy that house or going to buy the land that it's put on because everyone's kind of implying that it's like there was something unsavory or, but although they do say that, well, the land is not really any good because it's like a farming community. The land is not good for farming on because basically it's in the middle of a marsh. So this house is called Eel Marsh House. And now I did bring this up when I was talking about the Michael McDowell book, the Elementals. I don't know if this is where he got the idea from because I think these books came out like in a similar, because I think that one came out in the 80s too, or maybe even a little earlier. But it's kind of the same thing where Eel Marsh House is just this single house and it's sitting out on this little slip of land, like pretty much in the middle of a marsh. Like there's like an estuary and then there's just this big marsh and there's nothing else around. So it's just this house and nothing else. And you can only go to this house when the tide is out because there's this causeway called the 9 Lives Causeway, which I love. The rest of the time it's like underwater. So only when the tide is out can you get out to the house or come back from the house. And as I said, no one really has any reason to go out there. No one has even been out there for a while. Like people haven't even seen Mrs. Drablow in the many years, prior to her dying, she'd been like kind of a recluse out there. So no one has even like knew what she was up to. So basically he goes out there. He gets taken out on this like pony and trap by a dude named Keckwick, who also seems to know some shit about the town and about the house and stuff, but keeps mum about it like mostly everybody in the town does. So Arthur gets to this house and very quickly begins to realize that this was going to be a way bigger job than he thought it was going to be because there's just papers everywhere. And he's like, most of them are probably useless or probably nothing, but to get the job done correctly, he has to go through every single thing and make sure that nothing of importance gets thrown away. So he basically like sets to work. Now, when he first gets there, though, he notices, because, like, it's really creepy, like, the whole description of the house is, like, really, really creepy because, basically you're in kind of, like, I'm assuming, I think this is, like, the northern part of England somewhere, like, near the coast, and there's this estuary, and so when it's, like, stormy or cloudy outside, he's like, basically you can't see like where the ground ends and the sky begins because it's all just gray because it's all just water and stuff. So basically you have this impression of just how this house sitting out like in this foggy nothingness. And I think there's like a really good, the atmosphere, like the description of that is like really, really evocative and like really cool. So while he's at the house, the first thing he sees the woman in black again. And at this point, even though he's still kind of trying to feel like, well, that's got to be a person, because he said it looks like a person. He said it doesn't look like a ghost. It looks like a solid woman. But she keeps like disappearing, and he's like, look, I don't think that there's any other houses or any other place where this person could be coming from, because the causeway was underwater at this point. And also he starts to feel like when he sees her, he starts to feel all these overwhelming emotions like rage and hatred, and it's really starting to like freak him out a little bit. So he kind of starts to come to the conclusion that maybe something supernatural is going on. Now, in spite of that, and in spite of the fact that he got pretty freaked out, he does, want to do his job to the best of his abilities, because as I said, he's trying to get a raise, he's trying to get more money, so he really wants to not mess this up. Even though he has some misgivings about staying there because it's kind of a creepy place, he's like, well, I don't want to be here for like a whole week, so I'm going to have to stay in this house overnight because it will be quicker. I won't have to come back and forth with the tides and have to have Keckwick like bring him back and forth on the pony and trap and blah, blah, blah. So he's like, so I'm just going to stay overnight in this house and try to sort through all these papers as quickly as possible so I can get the fuck out of this town. Because as I said, everything seems a little weird in the place. Like I said, not hostile necessarily, but everyone's just kind of like real buttoned up, and no one will really tell him anything about what's going on or tell him anything about Mrs. Drablow or, who that woman might be or anything like that. As time goes on, he ends up staying in the house. I believe he stays at least a night or two. One night he actually gets stuck there because he's kind of like having a freak out, and then the tide comes back in and it's like there was a storm, and so the causeway wasn't, it didn't come back, and so the guy had to like come back and get him at like 2 or 3 in the morning or whatever. So while he's staying at this house, Samuel Daly, who he has befriended, as I said, he met him on the train, like coming to the place at the beginning of the book, he actually loans him a little dog, like a little terrier named Spider, like to keep him company. So Arthur and Spider like are hanging out at this house, and all kind of like real creepy, like pretty standard haunted house stuff starts to happen. There's like creaky noises. He starts seeing there's a room in the house that's like all the rest of the rooms can open, but there's like this one that won't open, and he keeps hearing this weird like thumping noise coming from within there. He starts just like having these real terrible emotions, like he feels like there's some big like overpowering rage or whatever. So he starts to get like super freaked out by it. Samuel Daly ends up saving him. And at this point, Samuel Daly finally tells him what the deal is with Eelmarsh House. Now, as I said, if you do not want to know what the secret of the house is or what was going on or who the ghost is or anything like that, then please click off now because I'm probably going to spoil the rest of the story. So just go read the book. It's actually very short. It's barely, I think it's like a novella. I think this edition here that I have, I believe is only like 154 pages, I want to say, or something like that. 164 pages. I almost got it right. But yeah, so it's like novella length. You can read it like in an afternoon very easily. So Samuel Daly finally tells him, and actually Arthur Kipps had started to put some of this together himself just from like some letters and some death certificates and stuff. Because one other thing that he heard a couple of times that he thought was probably, it seemed to like affect him a lot more than seeing the woman in black did, because like I said, she didn't look like spectral or anything. She just looked like a person. But he starts hearing these horrible noises of a pony and trap going into the marsh, like sinking into the marsh, and hearing like a horrible, like heart-rending child scream. And he's like, it sounded very much like a pony and trap going into the marsh and like, getting sucked down into the mud and like drowning everyone that was in it. So he heard that a couple of times and it really, really wigged him out, as it would, even though you couldn't see it because it was just so foggy. So he has found some death certificates. He's found some letters. And what they do is they piece together that Mrs. Drablow, the last woman that lived in the house, that has recently died, her sister, she had a sister that had a little boy named Nathaniel. Now, because the sister, whose name was Jeanette, because she was unmarried, and that was a big no-no back then, couldn't have kids out of wedlock. So basically, Nathaniel had to be adopted by Mrs. Drablow and her husband. Now, Jeanette allowed this at first because she was just kind of like, okay, because she saw like the necessity of it. But after a while, it seemed like Mrs. Drablow was like, yeah, I don't think I want you seeing your kid anymore. Don't come here anymore. And so there was like a bunch of, family conflict, like over, her getting to come see the kid. Finally, Mrs. Drablow, whose first name was Alice, I believe, she relents. And she's like, okay, well, you can come to the house and stay here and see your kid, but you are not allowed to ever tell him that you're his real mom. Those were the conditions that she, lived there and actually got to see him. So as it happened, and again, spoiler alert, so I'm not warning you again. So what ends up happening is that Nathaniel and his nurse, as well as the driver of a pony and trap, and the pony too, sadly, they were coming back from somewhere, and the pony and trap became lost in the fog, and all of them drowned in the marsh. And Jeanette was standing in the upper window and saw the whole thing happen. And so after she died, basically her ghost, who is the woman in black that we've been seeing, she died of like some wasting disease, hence why her ghost looks the way it looks. She was so filled with rage and anger, she blamed her sister. She blamed pretty much the whole town for doing this injustice upon her, like making her seem like she had to have her kid taken away. And then he ended up dying and drowning, and she watched it all happen and was kind of helpless to prevent it. So now her ghost serves as a sort of bad omen. So every time that she's seen in the town, and you don't find this out until like the last few pages of the book, that means a child is going to die. She's like an ill omen. So every time you see her, which is why when Arthur first sees her, like in the church and the cemetery, like at the beginning of the book at Mrs. Drablow's funeral, which is why Mr. Jerome acts that way, because it turns out that Mr. Jerome, who was the other solicitor who lives in the town, the last time that the woman in black was seen, it was his, I believe his daughter that ended up dying. That's how that ends up happening. And basically the end of the book, and this is kind of interesting, and like I said, I'll get into like the film adaptations as well, because I thought it was some of the changes that they made were kind of interesting. So at the end of the book, something bad is going to happen because, as I said, the last few pages, like Arthur finds out from Samuel Daly that it's like, okay, so every time the woman in black is seen, that means a child's going to die. Now, up to now, it's always been a child in the town, but Arthur's been there for a few days. No kids have died. Everything seems copacetic. Samuel's like, no, no kids have died, not yet. And Arthur's like, well, maybe the curse is broken now that Mrs. Drablow is gone. And, maybe she's not going to like seek vengeance anymore. And, Samuel's like, well, yeah, I hope so. But, because a kid didn't die in the town, some bad shit's going to happen. And I should note too, that unlike the movie adaptations, Arthur is actually telling this story like many years later. Like he has remarried, he has like a bunch of kids. So it's a really old school like Christmas British ghost story. Because like I said, it's a very British tradition like to tell ghost stories around Christmas time. So that's how this is framed. So like the first few pages of the book are Arthur Kipps. He's like, gearing up for Christmas with his wife and Esme and all his kids. And they're all telling ghost stories and being all like jocular about them and like trying to creep each other out. And he gets like all annoyed about it. And he's basically like, you guys don't even know, like that ghost shit's like, it's not even funny. Like, I don't know why you're telling them for amusement. He's like, I had the worst. He didn't tell his family like I had the worst fucking experience with ghosts ever. But what he basically does is like, I guess them telling ghost stories like reminded him of like the worst thing that ever happened to him back when he was younger. And so he's like, I'm going to write all this down, but I don't want my family to read it until after I'm dead. So that's kind of like the frame story. So that's kind of one thing that differs between the book and the movie adaptations is that that Arthur, at least, is not going to die because he's telling this story from many years later. So but that something bad's going to happen, right? So what ends up happening at the end of the old story is that Arthur, he has like a nervous breakdown essentially. So he ends up having to stay in the town for a while just because he keeps flipping out and everything. And then his fiance comes to get him, Stella, and they go back to London and everything's fine. They get married. He gets a raise and they have a son. Yeah, you know where this is going. So basically the son, I believe it's only like 6 months later. The kid's still pretty young. And he goes to the park with his wife, Stella. And Stella and the baby want a pony and trap ride. And it don't go too well, is what I'm saying. Again, a very bleak ending. So, he sees the woman in black at the very end and he's like, oh shit. The woman in black has like come to collect. Because apparently when Jeanette died, she was so full of rage that her child drowned in the marsh that she's basically just going to take everybody's kid that she can take as vengeance. So that's what ends up happening at the end of the book. He lives and actually goes on seemingly to have like a relatively happy life. He marries again. He has children and stuff, because that's kind of where you're at the beginning of this. And he's talking about what happened in the past. Now, interestingly, there have been several adaptations of this. Now, one of the most famous was actually, they did a stage adaptation. And if I remember correctly, the stage adaptation of this is the longest running play on the West End. Well, the second most. I think the first one is The Mousetrap, but this is the second longest running play on the West End. So it just goes to show how popular, how evergreen these, classic British ghost stories are, because that's exactly what this is. This is a very classic, it's very restrained. It even has like the Christmas, frame of him like telling, oh, well, you want a really scary story? Here's like this really horrible ghost story that happened to me like a long time ago. So it's just like, Dickens and just like M.R. James and just like those kind of things. So Susan Hill basically wanted to make something that was just like a classic English ghost story. And that's exactly what this is. So the play, I don't know much about that because I haven't seen it, but I have seen the 2 film adaptations. So in 1989, they made like a made-for-TV, in the UK. I think it was ITV maybe made it, and an adaptation of this, which I have seen it. It's very good. It's very creepy. They changed a few things. They changed everyone's names, which I'm not really sure why. Like some of their first names, some of their last names. I don't know, but whatever. And also, in the end... And then the end of the film adaptation too, everybody dies. Like Arthur dies too. So I thought that was kind of interesting that they made the ending like even bleaker and like sadder than it was in the book. Because in the book, yes, his wife and son die, but the woman in black gets them, but he lives and lives out a full life and, is able to finally recover and blah, blah, blah. Even though, he's still like haunted by it, obviously, but he goes on and still has like kind of a happy life. Whereas that really doesn't happen in the film adaptation. Now, they also made an adaptation in 2012. This one was starring Daniel Radcliffe. This was also quite good. This one was interesting because they really played up the woman in black as like a portent of a child dying in the town. In the book, they don't really go a lot into that. I mean, you don't really find out that she is like a representation of that until like the last few pages. I think the only other mention of it, it's like when he's at the funeral, like at the beginning of the book, like the author mentions that there's like a bunch of kids like behind the fence, like looking, but that's really the only mention there is. Whereas the Daniel Radcliffe movie, they really lean hard into every time the woman in black gets seen, that means a child dies. You know what I mean? So it's like a child dies like near the beginning of the thing. And it's like kids just keep dying like through the whole. In fact, if I remember, like the very beginning, they had like 3 little girls who were just like having a tea party, and then they just decided, hey, we're gonna like all jump out the window. And like some of them were like drinking poison or drinking lye or something like that. So they really kind of lean hard into like kids dying every time the woman in black is seen. The book doesn't really do that. Like I said, that's something that you don't find out until the very end. The book is very, very subtle. It takes place only like over a couple of days. There's not like a huge amount. I mean, it's told all from his point of view because, in the universe of the book, he's writing down his ghost story, from many years ago. So it's all, in first person. And he's basically just talking, just going through his days of like what's happening, how he's feeling, like what he's seeing, what he's hearing. So it's but it's very restrained. It's not kind of like, oh, a big thing jumped out of my face, or oh, this and that and the other thing. It's all real subtle stuff. It's kind of stuff like I saw the woman like across the graveyard. I was in the house and I heard this weird noise that turned out to be like a rocking chair, like in this locked up room. I went back in the locked up room later, and before it was like really neat with all the toys, and now it's like all messed up, like poltergeist activity or whatever. So it's all that kind of stuff, and everything just kind of happens once. And as I said, like no kids die. They basically mentioned that Mr. Jerome's kid died last time the woman in black was seen. I don't remember if they said like specifically when that was, but it's been a while. So I thought it was interesting, I guess, because, Hammer Horror made the Woman in Black that came out in 2012. So that I think they really wanted to amp up the horror aspect of it. So they had like a whole bunch of kids like die in the movie. And at the end of the movie, the Daniel Radcliffe one from 2012, the whole family dies there as well. Because in that one, Arthur, he has a wife that's already died, but he has a son. He's like a single father, but his son is like 6 years old. So I think they wanted to give him a kid that was a little bit older so that that kid could be in danger. You know what I mean? And I think they also wanted to kill his wife off before that happened, just because. So they kind of switched around the timeline somewhat, but I can see why they did that. And then at the end of the movie, him and his kid die. They get hit by a train. They see the Woman in Black like as they're trying to like leave the town on the train. It's a bleak ending, but it's also kind of a happy ending because they're implying that he's with his wife because she died like before the events of the movie, and now they're all together again. Although I think there's an implication too that it's just the Woman in Black like looking like his wife. I'm not really sure if that's what they were going for. I mean, I kind of got that impression, but I'm not really sure. Now, they also made a sequel to that movie, which I think was called Woman in Black 2, Angel of Death. I haven't seen that. Obviously, it doesn't have anything. It's not an adaptation of the book, and I'm not really sure if it's any good. I haven't really heard anybody talking about it, so I'll probably check it out one of these days, because I really did like the Daniel Radcliffe version. But if you see the movies first, which I did, in a way I'm kind of bummed that I watched the movies first, because I already knew, like, it had been a while since I'd seen the movies, but I already knew like what the story was, or like where the story was going. I already knew that it was like this woman and her kid had drowned in the thing, and she was like taking revenge on the town and like killing off their kids, or at least like acting as like, hey, your kid's gonna die or whatever. So I kind of already knew where it was going. But that said, I really, really enjoyed like the imagery of this book, like the way it's written. It just has this great like moody, creepy like kind of atmosphere, like the way she describes Causeway like going out to the house, and how everything just looks like this big like foggy thing of gray, and then there's just like this house out there with just these little tumble down gravestones. And I love like real gothic imagery like that. So like that I really, really liked, even though I knew where the plot was going mostly, although the end kind of surprised me because it's different than the movies slightly. But, so like I said, I wish I'd read it first and then seen the movies, because if you see the movies first, the movies are a lot more horror. There's a lot more shit going on in the movies than in the book, because the book is, like I said, it's very restrained, it's very subtle, because she was trying to do something like, like a classic British ghost story, like from late 19th, early 20th century type of thing, which I think was like massively successful. I mean, there's a reason that this book has been adapted so many times. There's a reason that this book is so, popular. There's a reason that so many people recommend it as being super creepy, because it really like immerses you in this whole atmosphere of like this little tiny town. It's just like covered with fog, and it's just like so creepy, and it's like everybody just has a secret. No one wants to tell you anything. And there's just like this creepy woman, like, kind of tootling around in the background, like every now with her weird skeletal face and like her mourning clothes and everything. So, as I said, if you're looking for something that's like slasher or something like that, it's nothing like that at all. This is a very restrained ghost story, but it's a really, really good one. And it's, if you want to read something that's kind of like evocative of, your old classic ghost stories, but is more modern, even though it's not set in the modern era, but is, written in more modern language, I'll put it that way, then I would definitely recommend it. As I said, the movie adaptations are quite good as well. The British TV one is actually quite good. It's very creepy. I think it was actually written, the British one was written by Nigel Neal, and I think he also did The Stone Tape, which was also like a made-for-TV kind of like horror movie, which was actually really good. I talked about it on my blog a couple of years ago. So yeah, they're both definitely worth checking out. And obviously the book is worth checking out too, if you have not read it yet. So yeah, The Woman in Black, Susan Hill, check it out. And that'll do it for this discussion, and I'll see you on the next one. Bye.